Forensic Science Lecture 12-2, Identification and Comparison of Hair. The purpose of examination of a hair follicle is primarily to establish whether the hair is human or animal in origin. And the most common request is to determine if the hair recovered from the scene matches the hair from a particular individual or suspect. There are some factors in comparison of hair that investigators look at. So when comparing the strands of human hair, there's particular interests made in matching the color, the length, the diameter. Some other important features are the presence or the absence of a medulla, distribution, shape, color, intensity of the pigment granules in the cortex as well. To do an examination of hair, they're using a microscope. A comparison microscope is an indispensable tool for the morphology, comparing the morphology characteristics of hair for forensic scientists. A careful microscopic examination of hair will reveal features that can distinguish human hair from animal hair. The scale structure, the medullary index, the medullary shape are important features for identifying animal hair versus human hair. However, when we're looking at examining hair, it tends to be subjective. And so it highly depends on the skill and the integrity of the analysis, the person doing the analysis. And so he or she needs to have years and years and years of comparison under their belt before they're considered to be an expert in the field. But for this reason, because it's so subjective, all hair analysis and comparison needs to be regarded as presumptive from the investigators involved in the investigation, and they have to confirm any of these findings by DNA analysis. There are a number of questions that can be asked by investigators that will help to give more significance to the evidence. One question is, can a body area from which the hair originated be determined? Normally, it's pretty easy to do that. The scalp generally has a little diameter variation along the shaft. They tend to have more uniform distribution of pigment. Pubic hair are shorter and curly with a wide variation of shaft diameters and with a continuous medulla. And then beard hair tends to be coarse with a blunt tip due to the shaving. And these are the pictures I have on this slide as well, in that order: head hair, pubic hair, and beard hair. Another question is, can the racial origin of the hair be determined? In many instances, it can, especially when we're looking between Caucasian and African Americans. African American hair tends to be kinky with a dense, uneven distributed pigment, where Caucasians usually have straighter, wavy hair with fine to coarse pigments, and their pigments tend to be more evenly distributed. However, with each of these come many exceptions to these rules. So yes and no comes from that. Can the age and sex of the individual be determined from a sample? The age cannot, with the exception of an infant. Infant hair tends to be fine, short, and have very fine pigments. In the past, dyeing or bleached hair may suggest the sex, but it holds little value today since trends have changed. Another question that is asked is it possible to determine whether the hair was forcibly removed from the body? Examination of the root may establish this if it fell out or was pulled out. If there's a follicular tag, it can indicate that it was pulled out. Naturally falling out tends to have a bulbous shaped root with no follicular tag, but no tag doesn't always mean that it fell out on its own. One aspect that they find plays a role is how quickly it was pulled out the faster it was pulled out, the more likely it is to have a follicular tag on it. Another question is if it's possible to determine whether hair came from a deceased individual. There is a phenomenon that's known as root banding. Postmortem decomposition may be accompanied by a darkening around the root, and so that is what is known as root banding. It leaves a discolored hair end with a point or a brush-like appearance to it. Another question are efforts being made to individualize human hair through the use of nuclear DNA from the root or the follicular tag? Yes, it is. And they have a high chance of gaining DNA evidence from a hair that is in the anagen phase or just entering into the catagen phase. Mitochondrial DNA can also be used if there's no DNA present. However, as we know, it cannot provide an individualization from it. And then the last question, can DNA individualize human hair? Nuclear DNA can, mitochondrial cannot. But mitochondrial isn't totally useless. It can provide an exclusion of a significant portion of a population as a potential contributor. With all of this, the collection and preserving of the hair evidence is key. When hairs are submitted for analysis, they must be accompanied by adequate number of standard and reference samples, both from the victim and the individual suspects. Samples and references must come from the same area of the body. So if you're looking for head hair, then that's where the samples and references need to come from. If it's pubic hair, then that's where it needs to come from. A minimum of 25 full-length samples from each area should be recovered, and this is accompanied by either pulling out the hair from the scalp or from the skin or cutting it at the skin line. But especially if they're looking for DNA evidence, they want to take it from the scalp by pulling it. This ends lecture 12-2. There's a quiz next class.